All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Natasha Peterson, and I am the Communications Coordinator for the National American Indian and Alaska Native PTTC, which is the Prevention Technology Transfer Center. We are so happy that we can have Ken Winters with us today, presenting Prevention of Teen Substance Use. I'm going to start with a couple introductory slides and then turn the time over to Ken. Dr. Winters. So this webinar is provided by the National American Indian Alaska Native PTTC. We are funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. We are part of a PTTC network, and our center is located at the University of Iowa in Iowa City. Okay. So this project is supported by SAMHSA, and the content is developed by the presenter. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of SAMHSA, HHS, or the American Indian Alaska Native PTTC. Following today's event, you will receive a follow-up email, which will include links to the presentation slides and the recording, information about how to request and receive CEUs. We are a NADAC certified center, and a link to our evaluation survey, or GIPRA. At the end of today's event, we will also share that link to the survey in the chat box. This survey is very important to our center and our funders to ensure that our events are beneficial to those that attend. We would really appreciate you taking a few moments to fill this out. It is voluntary, and you can skip any questions that you don't want to answer. If you have any questions about this, please let us know. Although we are gathered virtually today, we want to take the time to acknowledge the land and pay respect to the Indigenous nations whose homelands were forcibly taken over and inhabited. Please take a moment to read this land acknowledgement, which was created by 3 members of our team, Ella Driscoll, Keely Driscoll, and Sean Baer. And this land acknowledgement will also be included in the presentation slides that you'll receive following today's event. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Ken. And I'll have him introduce himself. Thanks so much.
Natasha, thank you. And also thank you to Cindy for helping set this up. I am Ken Winters. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure. I hope you find this useful, this presentation today, and I enjoy opportunities to have some dialogue at the end. Feel free if you have other questions you can't get to during our time, if you want to email me afterwards. I studied adolescent drug abuse since the late 1980s and have enjoyed an opportunity to be part of the various ATTCs over the years, and joined the prevention group, the National AIAN PTTC, when it was funded. You can see I have 4 big topics. The first one is an introduction, trying to get some contextual issues and facts out of the way. But the second and the third are the core parts of my talk. An overview of prevention strategies and approaches, spending some time on some examples I found of Indigenous programs, and then a summary. All right, we'll start with some introductory themes. So I am focusing on adolescents, and that is pretty much in the literature referring to 12 to 18-year-olds, usually middle and high school. Most of the discussion is going to be about alcohol and other drugs, sometimes tobacco, but most of the time it's going to be about non-tobacco substances. I thought I would give you the basic summary first, so you can see how this is going to play out, and hopefully you'll notice that I'm providing a lot of information that supports these summary points. Most teens are going to use substances sometime during their adolescence. And the extent to which you are going to have a current or future problem, that is linked to many factors. But a big one is how early in the teenage years you initiate substance use. And then there's several other, individual or personality as well as environmental risk factors. We'll look at them downstream. It is still the case the most commonly used substances by teens are alcohol, cannabis, and nicotine products. Even though there were all kinds of concerns about prescription drugs, abuse of pain medications, et cetera, among teenagers, it's still a low prevalent problem. And then prevention does work, and I'm going to emphasize that in several ways. Fortunately, there's now enough research so we know what some of the keys are to effective prevention. I think it does not have to be expensive or so heavy lifting that it becomes a barrier. So even low heavy lifting, low resource environment areas still, I think, have plenty of opportunity to implement prevention programs for young people. And outcomes are promising. Now, if you are thinking you're going to prevent most teenagers from living their teenage lives drug-free with good prevention programs, it's probably not realistic. But some of the best outcomes are where good prevention extends the age of initiation. And that's important, you'll see, for several reasons. And there is indications that more teens than ever are choosing to be drug-free. And many teens, if they are using at a harmful level, they're willing to show that they're reducing their risk or harm reduction behaviors. Some resources. There's a good one that's still time-honored, and that's NIDA's report on preventing drug use among children and adolescents. It has a second edition, that's the front cover there, and the website. What's interesting is there's not a third or a fourth edition. I think it's because the principles are showing to be so rigorous that there hasn't been a need to update that report. I put a treatment resources number 2 if you're interested. NIDA also has published principles of effective treatment for teenagers with a substance use disorder. But we'll be focusing on prevention. And then I wanted to highlight the National Center here. The prevention group has done several things throughout the years. I'm just profiling 3 of them here. Well, there was a prevention newsletter some time back, and then I'm profiling here 2 of its webinars or technology sessions. One of them focused on culture is prevention and how resilience and spirituality in Native American culture is so important for prevention. And then one of them focused on the importance of storytelling. So by going to the PTTC network website, you can do some window shopping and find these as well as other prevention resources. I found it helpful to go to academic centers that focus on indigenous populations to see what they had for prevention resources and information. And there are, I think, 3 big ones in the United States: Colorado, Johns Hopkins, and the one at University of Washington. You'll see me sample some of their materials throughout. But it's something to consider, always occasionally going to these websites and seeing what new grants they might have got funded or what new publications and other resources that they're highlighting. Okay, a little overview about general prevention strategies. This is probably basic for all of you. But to set it up, I just want to reflect on when you look at teenagers and the extent to which they use or get into trouble with substances, you might consider three general groups. And I have these groups with some sub-definitions, and then I've got some percentages. But at the bottom, I'm referring to a group that is either not using during the teen years or they're very infrequent. And estimates are that represents roughly 70% of young people. And then there's a middle group that is more moderate in their use. You might call it mild or moderate substance users. Roughly 25% of youth fit that. And then there's the serious, heavy using teenagers. They meet formal criteria for substance use disorder, probably at the severe end, and that can fall anywhere between 2 and 5%. So if you take that triangle and those three rough groups, and then we apply, whoops, and there we go, and we apply prevention strategies, you can see there's three rough breakdowns. So at the bottom, the 70% group, there's really selective or universal prevention strategies make sense. Our mild moderate group, some of them might need treatment, but many of them, they mostly have risk factors. And so that really could be appropriate for indicated prevention. And then the most severe group, we have to talk about prevention being treatment. Most of the prevention principles I'm going to talk about are relevant to our selective or universal prevention, but I'll note when we're getting into prevention strategies that are more for indicated youngsters. Some prevalence data can be helpful as we get a perspective on the lay of the land, a little more detailed than on the prior slides. Recent data published by SAMHSA provides an indication of American Indian, Alaska Native youth. And so they report three age groups. I put in the left, I boxed in the 12 to 17-year-old category, and you can see the percentages. So this is youngsters that were surveyed that met criteria, DSM, diagnostic formal criteria for an alcohol use disorder. And you can see the rates are fairly low, somewhere in the 1 to 3%. When those rates are compared to non-AIAN youth, the Native youth have a bit higher percentages, pretty much across those 4 years, 2015 to 2018. Not much higher, but a little higher. They also reported marijuana use disorder data. The numbers are actually pretty similar. The bars are higher because the left axis is changed from the prior one. So don't get the height of the bar to throw you. You still pretty much have kind of 2 to 3% among young people meet formal criteria for marijuana use disorder. And those also are slightly higher rates than what you find among non-Native youth. Some youth have both. SAMHSA didn't break that down into who suffers from both, but some of the youngsters in this category probably also met criteria for an alcohol use disorder. But both of these survey results are based on urban Native youth because of the way SAMHSA does their surveys. So what about youth who are in schools on or near reservations? So recent study had an opportunity to look at that. And they used survey items that are from a national survey. And they then went out and collected results 2016 and 2017 from students attending schools on or near reservations. I'm collapsing for you with the bottom bullet, the results across 8th, 10th, and 12th graders, because it's pretty much the same pattern. And there was higher lifetime and last 30-day rates of alcohol, cannabis, and several other illicit drug use rates when you compared those reservation student rates to general population that was given us the same kind of survey across the country. So there might even be higher rates of substance use among indigenous youngsters who are on reservations or near reservations compared to urban AIAN students. Something to keep in mind. It does speak to the importance, perhaps even the greater importance, of prevention programs on reservations. So there is some good news. Couple good news points. One of them is, generally speaking, among young people, binge drinking rates are declining. And you can see to the far right is the one most interesting. You can just see the decline from 2009 to 2019. And the rates here are the 2019 rates. If you went way over to the left, you could see just they'd be much higher numbers for 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. This is national data. They didn't break it down for Native youth. But that's somewhat promising since many prevention programs focus on the importance of, okay, if you're going to use alcohol, the binge drinking is where most young people get in trouble. Also, there's some new data that shows the trend in the positive direction of young people saying that they've gone through all of the youth years till the end of high school without using any drugs at all. And so these are the trend lines. In red, it's not as interesting because that's reflecting on no use of any drug in the past month, but the blue line reflects lifetime. So that means when 12th graders were asked, have you used any substances at all yet? And given an opportunity to say never or several other times, we're now up to, in the 2018 data, up to 31% of high school seniors say they have not used any substances. So keep in mind two things. This doesn't reflect young people who've dropped out of high school and are not reflected in 12th grade data. And that might mean that 31% is a little optimistic. And so when we say no use, that doesn't mean that they might have had a sip of alcohol or maybe taken a hit from a joint. But the point is they haven't used to the level of getting intoxicated. So roughly, with quotes, drug-free. But I think it's encouraging because if you just the blue line, you can see how it's tending to go upwards since these data were collected in '76. We'll see how that plays out as the years unfold. And is prevention program, particularly those in schools, having an influence? One of the senior authors of this paper really points to that, as well as the importance of prevention programs, including parents, and how parents are doing a better job in the home of reinforcing smart substance use behaviors, including drug-free behaviors. I'm going to move to a next topic about teen brain development. So I thought I'd just ask this question and you can think about the answer. What right or privilege in the US matches, whoops, gave the answer there, matches where experts place the age at which the brain is fully mature? The age at which you vote, age to gamble in casinos, the age at which you can legally rent a car, or the age you can legally serve in the military. So which of those three do you think closely matches when the brain is fully mature? And if you answered C, you got it right. Roughly age 25 is when the brain finishes most of its major maturation processes. So the other ages that are important in maturation and in socialization of young people, 18 and 21 are big ones in America, in westernized cultures. So it is interesting that there's still a reasonable amount of brain development going on past those ages at which we give youngsters a lot of responsibility and rights, or are asking a lot of them, particularly when it comes to the military, for example. This is important for our understanding of prevention. And that's why I'm going to just talk a little bit about brain development. If you want to learn more, there are two books I really like. David Walsh's book, Why Do They Act That Way? It's written for both parents and teenagers. It's a bit dated, but the principles still hold up, I think. And then Anthony Wolf's book is also excellent, Get Out of My Life, subtitle, First, Could You Drive Me and Cheryl to the Mall? A funny subtitle that in some ways reflects the impulsivity of adolescent brain and some of the emotionality that can go on that might have neurobiological roots. A couple principles about the developing brain. And one of them, very important, is the way it develops is important for understanding how we think of teenagers' behavior, how we interpret it, as well as how we might shape prevention programs. Because the brain is not developing evenly across all regions during the adolescent years. So 25 is so-called end of maturation, but throughout these developmental years, particularly in the years of 12 to 18, there's this imbalance of maturation. And what's happening is there's a faster maturation on what's called the limbic or ghost system. And there is slower maturation on the prefrontal or the brakes system. So one metaphor by Walsh is accelerator and brake pedal. So the accelerator system in the brain is maturing faster and the brakes system is maturing slower. So this imbalance could help explain a lot of risk-taking, certain kinds of decision-making, impulsivity by teenagers. When you're an adult with a fully mature brain, you're just better able to balance impulses with decision-making skills. Your prefrontal cortex is better able to weigh in more equally and not be so over-dominated or overpowered, if you will, by the limbic system. This slide represents a summary of developmental psychologists weighing in on what to make of this brain development pattern. So I've already tipped my hand a little bit. If you have part of the brain, the limbic system, which is kind of the go region, emotionality, motivation region of the brain, where a lot of the reward systems are located. If that's exerting more influence than the pause or brake systems, you're probably going to see some tendencies in the teenage years that you maybe don't see in such an exaggerated form during adulthood. So we looked at that literature and came up with this summary list. So this list comes from me and my colleagues, trying to reflect developmental psychologists. And you can see that it reflects certain preferences, 4 of them there. And some of them are very important as we understand health behaviors. 2 of them reflect a tendency for a teenager to not consider as much or have less ability to control emotions or not consider negative consequences as much. And then the last one is also reflecting on what is probably happening a little bit more often or with greater salience in the teen years, high attentiveness to social information and perhaps greater tendency to take certain kinds of risks and not show very good self-control. So all of these things are very normal for adolescents. It's part of normal development. When they occur in an excessive form, they could lead to problems. And surely there's all kinds of context that can also create some of these tendencies to perhaps exert too much of an influence and get a teenager in trouble or lead to bad decisions, including poor health decisions. We also took the list and asked ourselves, where might there be a significant overlap of these tendencies and risk for substance use? And we highlighted these, 6 of them: high excitement, activities with peers, novelty, low consideration of negative consequences, and a high tendency to be attentive to social life and to take risks. We thought those 6, in in some ways are risk factors for being curious about using drugs and perhaps even contributing to continued use of drugs because you don't think it's really a big problem and you're having fun with it and it's novel and peers are over influencing you. So in some ways, I've mentioned two things that are very normal about adolescence. Normal adolescence can lead to some of these kind of behaviors and values and attitudes due to brain development, and brain development might also contribute to a risk for substance use. Of course, it's not all brain development, and I'm just focusing that right now. There's so many interesting interactions and phenomenon that mediate and moderate how brain development influences behavior. And those kinds of things are getting studied, and it's very interesting science, and that field is making the neural development part of psychology quite an emerging research field. I mentioned that this is relevant for prevention. One way it is, I think it's interesting and important to teach young people about their brain development and how that intersects with even the science of addiction, how that can lead to a tendency to be curious and continue to use drugs and perhaps get into trouble with it. So the teen brain, in some ways, is creating some enticement for substance use. And teaching teenagers about that, I think, can help them reflect that that there's something going on, and it's important to consider that, and might even be important to make sure they're not damaging that developing brain by using. Another implication, I think, is in the importance of using prevention programs that are what I call teen brain friendly, and I've listed 4 things here. I think all the great ones that are evidence-based and some that I'm going to highlight have these features. And so the teen brain, I think, likes things that are engaging and relevant and fun, and they're also going to benefit when there's certain skills being promoted, because the teen brain is still on a learning curve, I would consider, for being optimal with decision making, because that limbic system is pretty active. And so programs that teach these skills provide practice for them and show the importance of these skills, I think, are quite strong. And I also take brain science and talk to parents about it. We've taken the word parent and provided 6 key words with these key words reflecting the first letter or a letter of the word parent. And some of these reflect directly brain development. Some of them also reflect the importance of good parenting practices. Feel free to use this if you're working with parents or giving parent talk. I use it by breaking parents into 6 groups. Each group has a letter and a principle, and then they're supposed to come up with some insights about that principle and some examples of how to use that principle to help promote healthy teen behavior. And then you have the small groups come back in a large group, and they all share their answers, and everyone learns about all the letters and all the principles. More on this later when we talk about parents. A great parent website is partnership at drugfree.org. Got the link there, and they actually are building a large resource that not just talks about prevention, but about intervention if your teenager's already starting to use, how to get treatment if you have a serious problem at hand, and then some of the important ways parents can support recovery. Let's move into the second topic, core principles of prevention. So I'm going to start first with providing an overview of the key principles from the NIDA document, Preventing Drug Abuse Among Children and Adolescents, still a great resource, as I mentioned earlier. And what I've done, while there's numerous principles, I've blocked them into categories to make it a little easier to digest. If you read the handbook, you'll see that the first four principles have to do with the importance of prevention programs promoting risk and protective factors. And some of the sub-principles are making sure you enhance protective factors and reduce risk factors. The importance of addressing all forms of drug abuse, because the risk factors are so interrelated, it doesn't make sense to have separate prevention programs just for individual drugs. Now, we'll talk about the need for some specificity within a general prevention program coming up, but it makes sense to couch them all within a generic substance use curriculum. Then there's importance of addressing risk factors and protective factors that are relevant to the local community. And that's why good prevention manuals will probably provide an overview of what are likely some core risk and protective factors, but it's very advisable to adjust your program based on what you might be learning from the local community. Just within indigenous populations, indigenous urban youth might be facing many different risk and protective factors than tribal youth. People living in the Midwest, some can be addressing many different things than people on the coast, or urban versus rural within a given state. And you don't want to miss those because you've got to make the program relevant. Just to impress upon you, the value of addressing risk factors in a substance use program to address that also will have potential to improve many other adolescent behavior problems. So on the right, you can see a list of community, family, school, and individual risk or protective factors. And then there's check marks to the right under what the research says is the link between that factor and different problem behaviors. You can see there's a lot of overlap. So a good drug abuse prevention program that's tackling a wide range of risk and protective factors is probably going to have some value in reducing delinquency, violent behavior. It's probably going to have value in improving school performance. So you don't necessarily have to have prevention programs for separate problem behaviors. Obviously, you could tweak things, but the value of having a rich drug abuse prevention resource world that we live in, you're going to benefit by also addressing many other problem behaviors. This is even the case that when substance use might not be the cause of some of these other problems. So it can be problematic to figure out which came first. But there's just great value in focusing on substance use, using and taking advantage of these good programs, and realizing you're going to have wonderful secondary effects. And second point I want to raise from the slide is the bullet there to the left. A teenager's risk for substance use, as well as some of these other problem behaviors, is usually based on how many risk factors as opposed to specific ones. So while there is some exceptions to that principle, most of the literature suggests it's the number of them. So when you can reduce the group of risk factors for a given teenager, without worrying about which ones you're reducing, you're probably optimizing the effects of your program. Recent study looked at to what extent do these common factors apply to Native American youth. And this slide shows you a heck of a list of community, family, peer, sensation-seeking, and school risk factors. Some of them are written in the direction of protective factors. Where does this risk and protective factor list come from? From the well-known, well-researched communities for prevention program. And so they decided to see the risks and protective factors that they focus on. Are they relevant for a non-urban population? Because that Communities That Care project was developed with largely middle-class white sample. The numbers on the right have to do with the ability to measure these accurately. The bottom line of what we're seeing here is that when Native American youth were filling out survey about the extent to which these risk or protective factors are part of their life, they were responding to the items roughly in the same way that the original sample responded to them, in that original sample being a non-native sample. So it's kind of good news because so many programs are capitalizing on core risk and protective factors with the assumption that they're relevant to a native population, maybe without testing that ahead of time. But this is confirmation that it's likely doing so is based on pretty good principles. Okay, back to our principles from the NIDA handbook. Principles 5 through 8 focus on the importance of school programs. I really like the quote from my colleagues, Larry Shire. School programs, he's saying, is arguably provides the biggest bang for the dollar, as both low and high risk students present in school and can be exposed to the intervention. So it is a very efficient way to deliver prevention programs. I'm highlighting from the NIDA handbook the earlier school programs, elementary school, best to focus on some core decision-making skills and the importance of school achievement. When you get older youth in the middle, junior, and high school, then you need to hone in more on the issues of peer relations and importance of being assertive and learning important drug resistance skills. So what's the big difference between those? Well, as youngsters are growing up and getting into the middle and high schools, the influence of peers and social life is so prominent. And so it's important that prevention skills hone in on that. And there's already probably plenty of opportunities to use, so you want to really get specific with drug resistance skills. Next set of principles have to do with family programs and the importance of including the family. And so I've summarized it by showing you the risk factors you want to reduce and the protective factors that you want to increase. And good programs, even the school-based ones, have a family component and will tend to focus on these kind of features. So when you look at this list, I see two major themes. One is parents needing to be good with communication skills to the point where they're being good listeners and they're providing support when the teenager needs it. Teenagers that say, I can turn to at least one parent to discuss a personal problem. When a teenager says yes to that or agrees to that, that probably means that parents or parent are doing a very good job with communication skills. Then the other general theme with this list here is the having to do with monitoring or disciplining. And so this would be being good at setting rules, making sure everyone knows about the rules, having good consequences when expectations aren't met, as well as having rewards when they are met. Back to a teenager soundbite. If a teenager agrees with this, that means parents are probably doing a good job with monitoring. If a teenager says, I know my parents would be disappointed if I did not live up to expectations. That teenager that says yes to that or agrees to that is likely coming from a family where there's some pretty strong and very realistic kind of monitoring and discipline. just keep in mind, monitoring, disciplining is not just responding when something negative happens. You've got to also make sure to include the positives when teenagers are meeting expectations. Next set of principles focus on the community and the environment. These principles are more complicated to implement. If you can combine some kind of community or environmental component to a school component, you probably are doing better than if you just did one or the other alone. But it can be a lot easier just to go into a school and implement a curriculum, have the teachers or peer-led individuals implement it. But to get a community to be involved, you got to have more staff, more planning, and likely more resources. The Communities That Care project is a great one that shows how to do it. And the long-term data on that is excellent. But it's community-wide, and so it takes a fair amount of involvement. Environmental strategies are getting discussed these days, particularly because marijuana is getting legalized more, and people are having to figure out perhaps how to apply some of the good tobacco environmental strategies now to cannabis with prevention messaging and limits on where dispensaries are located, for example. But there are several examples that have worked in the tobacco field, in their as well as alcohol, and so they're also worth continuing to implement, particularly as we have to deal with some new challenges with the legalization of cannabis. A sidebar comment about the community approach. This has to do with the issue of tackling social norms. You may know about this. It's commonly done on campuses, particularly because that's a young adult age group, very vulnerable to a false belief about social norms. What happens here is usually two steps. You get good assessment data on use patterns among students on a campus. And then you develop awareness campaign to educate the students of the results of that survey. And usually the results are that fewer students are binge drinking or using illicit drugs than perhaps what is expected. So a common phenomenon, like to the right here, University of Albany, just talked about how low percent of students, let me move this over. Oops. 88% of University of Albany students have partied without using alcohol. If most students individually wouldn't have predicted that, but when you ask in a survey and you crunch the numbers, you get results like that. So students thinking, oh, gee, everybody drinks when they party. I don't want to be left out. It helps disabuse young people of that kind of phenomenon. And you can do it with just all kinds of behaviors, use patterns, whether it's any use, heavy use, how many use before class and don't use before class, etc. And all of them usually work in the direction of, wow, it's usually a low percent that are doing these harmful things. And educating young people about that usually leads then for those that are doing in a harmful direction to pull back, or those that might be curious about going in the harmful direction, not to go that route. The last set of principles had to do with program delivery or the challenges of implementation. So let me read that first principle. When communities select programs to meet their needs, the implementation should retain the core elements of the original program. Retain the core elements, but that doesn't mean you are restricted or should feel like you can't make some adaptations. And so what would those adaptations be based on? These specific issues in the community. Remember, one of the principles was making sure you address risk and protective factors that are relevant for the local region. And so you might have to make some adjustments to the program content. But you shouldn't feel like you're going to create a weak program if you make some adjustments, as long as you retain core elements. What's a core element of a program? Some manuals don't do a good job of educating users of that, but you can always contact the publisher or the author and see if what you're planning might look like be acceptable. Some more implementation principles. Prevention is ongoing. Can you come up with a sustainability plan so that the program continues on? It is a big challenge. If you get a grant or you get initiative and people get excited and then perhaps that initiative goes away, it's very challenging. But implementing something, for example, in a school system that's a regular part of the program, or it's a regular part of a community health program, that's often a way to use structure to support long-term sustainability. If you're doing a school program, training the teachers rigorously is very important. I might add to that, if you're going to have a peer-led training program, you got to do the same kind of good training of the peers. Evidence-based prevention interventions are cost-effective. I'll come back to that in a minute, because I want to then just reflect on a more emerging principle, and that is figuring out ways to significantly adapt or personalize delivery when feasible. So I mentioned that you want to keep core elements, but there's still a lot of options for personalizing. And I think with new technologies and with some of the new science coming out about ways to personalize, you might be able to optimize effectiveness without increasing cost or strain on your resources. More on that later when I get into my summary. I just wanted to show you an analysis done in early 2000 that looked at cost benefit of several kinds of prevention programs. And what do you notice? Well, two at the bottom don't look like they're doing very well in terms of benefit above cost. So the B minus C column is the key one here. And the two at the bottom, intensive juvenile supervision and the Big Brothers, Big Sisters program, they don't show much benefit at all over cost. But the four above have outstanding benefits above cost. Cost offset might be another way of putting it. Now, the cost can be sizable, and thus to convince systems to pay for that so you get the benefits can be difficult, because sometimes the benefits don't show up till years later. And politicians that want to support an initial cost may not be around for the benefit. That can be a stumbling block of getting a good program in place. But it does speak to the overall principle that evidence-based and well-run prevention programs do have wonderful benefits. And there's the bad ones. Okay, a couple other principles. And I'm going to connect now prevention with brain development. The later the initiation of drug use, the less likely there's a problem either later in the teen years or later in life. If you can delay the initiation of drug use with your prevention program, you are doing wonderful things for a teenager's health. I put a red box around the substance abuse line, and it's compared to several other disorders, but the bottom line of these data are that adolescence is the peak time for the clinical onset of many major behavioral or mental disorders. This data set shows you that probably ADHD is the one that has the earliest onset, but you can see substance use, its modal onset is right around 17. Now that's having a substance use disorder, not initiating when you start using. So that take that substance use or abuse row, and the teenager that's having a substance abuse problem or substance use disorder right around age 17, well, the odds are they started right around age 12 or 13. So you don't want to wait too late for a good prevention program. But it just speaks, I think, these data, the importance of prevention for all mental and behavioral disorders, because so many of them have onset during adolescence. And it means you have a wonderful opportunity to try to treat early and prevent negative trajectory of those particular disorders. One thing, what did you notice about one thing of the middle row, mood disorders? That tends to have the latest onset, but you can see that the reddish bar goes from light to dark over the longest span. So it does speak to the data that suggests, well, there can be a lot of early onset mood disorders in the early youth years, but probably the peak years are more in the early 20s. Recent study looked at the risk of developing a cannabis use disorder based on initiation. And so they compared a group of youngsters that started initiating cannabis during adolescence, and then a group that started initiating in young adulthood. And they looked at whether you had a cannabis use disorder within 12 months or within 36 months of initiation. So what two big themes from this? One big theme is if you started in adolescence compared to young adulthood, you had a higher risk of establishing or getting to the point of having a cannabis use disorder much sooner. I'm sorry, a much higher risk level than if you waited later in life. And also, you do have risk of developing cannabis use disorder 3 years out. So the green bars, they're higher for both, but it does mean that the risk of developing a problem can extend several years if you initiate early in life. They really do support the principle, these data, that there is a faster transition to a cannabis use problem the younger the age of initiation of use. Another reason prevention is important. The later that the later you get treatment, the worse your outcome. So if you can prevent substance use during the teen years, you're likely preventing getting a problem. And that's likely going to have a much better outcome when someone then eventually gets a problem in their adulthood years. This shows you that the earlier you initiate your substance use, the longer it takes you to reach abstinence if you eventually have to get treatment. So now we're talking about not just preventing initiation in a substance use disorder, but what happens if you have the problem big enough that you need treatment, and how does that translate downstream with reaching abstinence? The bottom line of this is that for those that, hang on a second, got to move this over. Look at the red line. If you started using before age 15, it took 50% longer for you to get abstinent after treatment than if you waited till after 21 to start using. So all of these in the sample needed treatment, but it just shows that it's tougher to recover from a problem if you started in the early years and if you started later. Now, brain development might be implicated here. Also, perhaps many other learning phenomenon and other recovery phenomenon are at play. But it speaks to the importance of, early prevention. We might prevent rapid onset of a substance use disorder. And early prevention might also help those later who maybe prevention didn't work. They're going to get a problem and get treatment, but they're going to have a better course of recovery because they didn't use early in life and they waited at least till longer. So I'm being a little cynical, but if you wait till 21 to use a substance, you greatly reduce your risk of having a substance use disorder. It could be about 5 to 7-fold reducing your risk. Also, if you're going to use and you get heavy use and you get to have a problem, you by 50% are going to get into recovery quicker than if you did all that substance use and heavy use in the teen years. Okay, a couple issues on the latest substance use phenomenon that are relevant to teenagers and prevention programs. The vaping nicotine is increased significantly. It's now more common than cigarette use. So look at the right hand chart here. Nice declines among 8th, 10th, and 12th graders of rates of cigarette smoking in the past month. Great declines over 10 years. Now over here, this is daily smoking as compared to daily nicotine, and you can see, look at the highest bars. That's the daily nicotine rates, and that's compared to daily smoking. Daily smoking really low. Ouch. Daily nicotine is relatively high or much higher. So we gained a lot with our great tobacco prevention programs and turning teenagers away from the cigarette, but the vaping phenomenon has aroused their curiosity, and we now have daily vapors. Another big threat is the legalization of cannabis and how norms are changing and availability. You may know that now 17 states have legalized it for adult use. I know all states that have legalized it that way, they have age 21 as the minimum age, but that still can have implications for teenagers. A related phenomenon of new trends is that the potency of typical cannabis is just much more harmful. So THC levels on average are now around 14 to 15%. Compared to 3 to 4% in years ago. This is just the confiscated cannabis products. So in many legalized states, you can buy cannabis products with THC potency much higher than 15%. Colorado is so concerned about it, there's been pushback, and they might limit the THC levels in products that are sold. And there's also a big campaign to legalize marijuana. And so the strategies of big tobacco are now being used by what some call tobacco or big tobacco 2.0 or big weed. And so young people are being targeted, products are being packaged in ways that are attractive to young people. Even though states have said it's 21, but that has led to a lot of access by 21-year-olds to products that surely can be easily used by pre-21-year-olds. And of course, it sets a tone that is not favorable when it comes to perception of harm. This just shows you daily marijuana use and past year marijuana use is significantly increasing among 8th and 10th graders. A little bit increase of daily marijuana use among 12th graders, but 12th grade overall use has stayed steady. But this is worrisome. The younger youth are actually showing a greater increase of marijuana interest. And this shows you the green bar is the perceived of great risk of marijuana use from a national sample. Forget the bars here. That represents US plus one state, but I just want to show you that over the last 10 years, there's just been a significant decrease in the percent of teenagers that say, yeah, using marijuana could lead to great risk. It's much lower. And as many of you know, if the risk profile is going in this direction, the use patterns are likely going to increase. I'll skip this because I want to get to our programs. So I did some work and tried to highlight some exemplary programs in the prevention world for Indigenous youth. And so I've got a few to summarize for you. If you want more information on any of these programs, please email me. Living in Two Worlds is an interesting one because it took an evidence-based program developed for Westernized youth called Keeping It Real, which had some really great outcomes, and did some adaptations. And so this program is intended for middle school students. So we're looking at young people that many of them haven't started to use yet. And it was school-based. It was, I thought, rigorous because it had 12 sessions and it was manualized so teachers could be easily trained. And the program had two big focus. One is on strengthening resiliency and certain resistance skills, and another one on promoting Indigenous cultural engagement. So I've got some specifics for you here. Specific skills included drug resistance skills and better decision-making. Now, do you think those are good for the teen brain? Yes. I would argue that's where the teen brain needs some help because they're not necessarily doing the best with brain development with optimal or very balanced decision-making. And then several cultural engagement aspects to it. I just have one example here. It's where students identify a personal value that reflects resiliency, and then they are to describe that value with a story. And a nice way for storytelling to support the oral tradition in Indigenous culture. The research study that compared the adapted version versus Keeping It Real showed that the Living in Two Worlds program showed better outcomes than the parent program it was based on. Project Venture, very intensive year-long program that includes both school and outdoor experiential components. This is intended for grades 5 to 8, but it's an indicated program because it aims at youth that are already showing high risk profile pattern. And the model it's organized around is guided by Native traditional values, including family, learning about the natural world, spiritual awareness, service to others, and respect. And I've listed 4 key program content components here. As is typical, in-school content often can focus on problem solving and drug resistance skills, but the program includes several games and initiatives to make it interesting. So outside of school, there are several features. There's an after-school, weekend, and summer skill building activity component. There's a summer camp where youngsters are immersed for 3 to 10 days in these activities. And then there's an additional, I call it a supplemental feature, where it promotes community service by supporting leadership skills and leadership projects. But it targets here more than just the at-risk youth. It's targeting older youth and parents. So I like that feature because it tries to, well, build content for the whole family, but it also is a chance for young people who are older than the grades 5 to 8 to perhaps sharpen their potential to be good role models. Talking Circle program, the Intertribal Talking Circle Intervention Program. This was developed by 3 tribal communities. And similar to the prior one, they took an existing program, teen intervention program, but they tailored it for each tribe. So each tribe went through a kind of similar process of conducting focus group and getting advice from researchers, Indigenous researchers, or researchers who study Indigenous health. And they all came up with a tailored version. But common elements occurred throughout all of them. I've listed them here. One important feature was to promote dialogue between the many generations of community members, making sure elders are involved, building and supporting community-based activities. If they didn't exist, the idea was to develop them. And these activities, as you might expect have a lot of opportunity to promote resilience skills, but also to highlight traditional cultural values and activities. And content also tended to focus on substances that and the consequences of substance use, and also looking at the wide array of social issues that might be at the root of many of poor health decisions made by young people. So the other two are projects that have some interesting assessment angles to them. The Culture is Prevention project is just, from what I can tell, underway, and it's going to have more to it than what they've already developed. But this multi-phase project involves 6 urban indigenous health organizations in Northern California, aiming to promote adolescent health among AIAN youth. To date, it hasn't done more than develop an assessment tool that they're going to use to help provide the basis for prevention programming. But what they did is they took a Canadian culture connected scale and adapted it and created a 29-item questionnaire. And then they did some research to see how well it's related to mental health among young people. And sure enough, the youth that scored high on this culture connected scale also reported more mental health. Or the other way of saying it is they weren't very well connected to cultural activities and heritage. They showed poorer mental health. So they're going to take these themes that they're learning from the assessment tool and use that as a basis to build a community-based multi-phasic prevention program. So it'll be interesting to see downstream. And then the last one I'm going to highlight is an interesting idea to assess whether a community, whether it's urban or tribal, is ready to tackle the problem of improving the health and well-being of their native youth. And so the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute is developing and validating what's called an assessment community readiness instrument. And so the readiness, they define as the degree to which a community has the capacity and is prepared to take action on behavioral health issues. And so they're using this tool among community leaders and stakeholders and other experts in adolescent health that are local, and they're going to get profiles of the various communities based on 6 dimensions. And these 6 dimensions basically reflect how you might think of readiness, all the way from I think there's a health issue, it's an important topic that we should address as a community, and I'm prepared to help, and I think there's support for me to help. And so you can see readiness is got multiple dimensions to it, and so you can profile a community and see where they're strong or where they're lacking. If you're interested more on this assessment tool, send me a note. So now I'm going to provide a summary, which is really an overview of where I think we are with prevention science nowadays, and where are some promising avenues for the future. So my summary here is a little bit more than just summarizing what I just said, but I am going to reflect on a lot of the literature I used already, but I'm also going to turn that into a synthesis. So I've got several principles that I'm going to offer to you. This could be my way of saying, here's key ingredients to establishing good, culturally relevant prevention programs for Indigenous youth. one principle would be using the NIDA handbook and trying to infuse and include as many of those principles as possible. Remember, there were 12 of them, all spanning from risk, protective, school, community, parents, and implementation. Trying to include as many of those principles as possible would be very advisable. Understanding and appreciating that culture is prevention. So just by including culture into your program, core culture, the traditions that are reflected in your tribe, the heritage, and exciting young people to connect to those cultural elements in and of itself is great prevention. I've got a quote here from basically a synthesis quote from several sources. Growing evidence that AIAN youth who identify positively with their native heritage, maintain connections with extended family, and integrate traditional values into their lives are less vulnerable at risk for behaviors, including at risk for problem behaviors, including substance use. Personalizing a program with still maintaining core elements also is a principle I want to emphasize. I think this is one way of not only optimizing effectiveness, but I think it also helps you make the program more relevant and interesting and fun for a teenager. And personalization models are starting to get built and studied. Some people do it based on profiles of the risk pattern of a set of teenagers. And so they'll look at different typologies of risk profiles and then assign different types of content. But you can have choices among teenagers. They can choose how much content, order of content, who delivers the content. All of those could still maintain core elements of a good prevention program. And the digital age we live in makes it a lot easier to apply some of these personalization approaches. You can imagine if you have apps or if the content's digital, you have ways to make it more flexible when you're implementing. Promote resiliency and positive psychology. So resiliency defined as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or even significant sources of threat. I have the rubber band as the metaphor because on one hand, you have to be strong like a strong rubber band, but you also have to show some ability to adapt, to be flexible. You optimize your strength by also having some flexibility. I'm a fan of psychology from a positive perspective. Formal definition of positive psychology: a focus on human thoughts, feelings, and behavior that support a person's, I'll even say community's, strengths instead of weaknesses, and an emphasis on the good in life, I'll add, a community, instead of repairing the bad. So not always being overly attentive to looking in the rearview mirror about what happened in the past, but moving forward and focusing on the good and how you can support that good. And good prevention for young people. If you look at the good programs, I think they do this, support resiliency and usually have a positive psychology spin. But if it's adding more of it, to me is better. Here's some examples of resiliency skills or positive psychology themes. I won't go through all of them, but if you see this list, you'll realize that some of them have to do with teaching specific skills and coping strategies to young people. And some of them are what a community can do, such as number 8, helping support teenagers to be guided by core traditional values. Teen brain science, I think, helps also elevate the relevance, engagement, and effectiveness of your program. There's a free resource down at the bottom that provides I think, a really nice way you can easily teach this. and just included in a core prevention curriculum. And that resource not only helps educate teenagers about what challenges they have in making decisions during the teen years, but it also does a nice job of how the teen brain can be quite vulnerable to the effects of substances when it's used during those brain maturation years. I think parents are key preventionists. I call them prevention agents. And so having content that addresses parents, having parents aware of what prevention programs are being engaged, having specific activities for parents and the whole family are ways you can bring parents into the fold. It can be tough, but you have to remind parents when they're dealing with a teenager, particularly when that teenager is doing a good job pushing back from parents' influence, that parenting still matters. They can still be an important role model. And in the long run, when teenagers are asked, after they've grown out of the teen years, about their parents in the throes of teenage life, they appreciated the fact that the parents hung in there, stayed with them, and they still, perhaps subtly, perhaps it wasn't obviously done, but still were influenced by that wonderful role model in the home. So those are the 6 summary principles. Thank you for this opportunity. If the group feels so inclined, we can chat some and have some dialogue. I see a lot of people correctly answered rent a car with the little quiz question. Any thoughts, questions from the group? We might have lost Natasha. She's
Hi, Ken, I'm here.
You're back.
Thanks so much for your presentation. We have loved it. It has been so informative, as Yvette said in the chat box. If anyone has any questions they want to ask Dr. Winters, you can type it in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself, or even any comments, things that you're doing in your communities, we'd love to hear.
I know it was a lot of information to pack in. You know, one soundbite I took away after I was researching this and pulling this together is, boy, it's really good that for about 25 years, there was a lot of prevention science funded projects. And it looks like what they learned, that whole body of literature, is still very helpful today. Now, I mentioned new threats, things you can do to even modernize your work. And of course, the principle of adapting to culture is more new, but it's great to see that while young people are changing, society is changing, there's cohort effects. You know, I think we're still learning, you know, youth has its core challenges and core risks, but also core assets, and is still responsive to healthy messages when it's presented well and at the right time and follows all the principles. Also, I did mention the back of the NIDA handbook has examples of exemplary programs. They don't include any what I think are exemplary programs from Indigenous research, but you know, if you're interested in what at least National Institute on Drug Abuse says are exemplary ones, we studied a lot of them. If you're not sure about a program you might be using or adapting, and you want to send me a note, we'd be more than happy to weigh in on it.
Thank you, Dr. Winters. And we're going to also share Dr. Winters' email and contact so you could reach out to him for any of these resources. Yeah, Andrea says she'll be in touch. He or she'll be in touch. So yeah. All right. Will there be, if there are no more questions or comments, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Winters, for sharing your time and your knowledge with us, as always. We really did enjoy this webinar. We'll also put it on our website for those who would like to go back. Yeah, we will be sending follow-up emails with our survey link for you to let us know how you enjoyed this program and what we can do better for future webinars. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon and rest of the day. Hope to see you soon. Thank you.
And thank you, Cindy and Natasha. Everyone have a great rest of the week.
Thank you, Dr. Winters.